So thank you for coming on, Johnny. I thought it would be very fun and interesting to have you come on the podcast because, and just to preface, Johnny is from Ramsar Robert Stern Associates, very, very high end and notable, renowned architecture firm out of New York City. But, I thought we would have a sense of relatability here, given that we're both in the New York market and have experience working on these types of projects. But then what happens when you venture outside of New York and experience sort of feedback and receptiveness to other markets and trends? And I think it'll be interesting for you to share some of those experiences when dealing directly with the owner. So let you introduce yourself instead of me doing it for you.
Well, sure. Well, first, Adrian, thank you for having me on your show. It's a pleasure to be on your show. And as you mentioned earlier, my name is Johnny Cruz. I'm a partner at Robert A.M. Stern Architects. And as Adrian mentioned, we have one office here in New York City, but our reach is global. So we do work all over the world, not just New York or the US, so other locales as well. But great to be here.
Awesome. It's funny as well, and I don't know if you have had this experience. As of late, I've walked around with pedestrians, called either friends or family members or whoever, and I try to remove myself from knowing buildings and knowing facades because I realized that, call it, before I was in this industry, I didn't pay attention to the detail at the level that I do now. And so sometimes you forget the level of knowledge and just insight people have into, call it, buildings. But it's just like us, if we were to go into, I don't know, sea exploration or something, we would be totally unfamiliar to it. And there is a very particular look in the design of your buildings. Call it, is that a theme that spreads around the office? Do you really aim towards, being onboarded on projects to be of a certain caliber or have a certain look? I don't know many other architecture firms. There's only really a handful that you can look and say, oh, I know that's a Geary building or whatever it is.
Sure. Well, I think you hit the nail right on the head. If you go to a Frank Gehry, you just mentioned him, you know exactly what you're going to get, right? Richard Meyer, Zaha Hadid, so on and so forth. It's a very specific point of view. It's a very, I think, architect-centric point of view. I think our approach is a little bit different. I always think of ourselves and the work that we do as contextual. So what do I mean by that? I very much want our buildings to be sort of a city, of a certain context, of a certain culture, right? Whether it's New York, whether it's Los Angeles, Chicago, Hong Kong, mainland China, whatever. I'm very much interested in sense of place, sort of a specificity as it relates to a particular region or a culture. And I think, our buildings very much respond to that. And I want them to be sort of inevitable. Like they were always going to be here. Like I can't take, like a New York building, something we might design in the city here, and then transport that to Texas, let's say. It just wouldn't work. So our buildings are very much of the city, of whatever context they may grow out of. And one other interesting thing, we're talking about New York earlier, about you walking around the city and not necessarily knowing which buildings are which. And our buildings essentially blend in, I would say. And if you look at, like, for instance, 15 Central Park West, which is one of our more notable buildings, and this is true. This is not hyperbole. This is true. I often, when I'm in the area, I will walk around and say, do I want to look back at some of the details or how the building meets the ground and so forth. And I've overheard people, tourists or what have you, walk by our building and say, this must have been done in the 30s, I bet, when in fact it was done, in this century. So I take that as a compliment. the building does have the sort of panache, the sort of detailing that was characteristic of the pre-war apartment houses that sort of dot Central Park West. But, you know, it was, of course, built for, you know, the current standards of living, luxury living, and so forth. But anyway, as far as a point of view, it always depends on the locale, you know, the region that we're designing for.
It's funny that what I was thinking as you were speaking, if you ever ask for feedback with the people around you without giving context that you either worked on the building or had some influence on the building, just to hear the real truth.
Oh, some feedback. Well, you know, it's always positive, I would say. And you know, the outside world, they often look at our work as sort of more on the traditional side, I would say, and that's fine with me. That's fine with me. And it, you know, people, I think what they appreciate, some of the things I do here is that we design for standards of living that varies. So what do I mean by that? You know, at the high end, at the highest end of the market, let's say in New York City, there's a certain expectation on how rooms go together, procession of rooms, proportions, all those things. But that same sort of idea of how a plan works would not work in somewhere like Miami, where things are generally more open. But I think what I often hear is that they appreciate that we respond, that we listen to the demands of a local market and design to those standards, right? But it's not necessarily feedback, but it's more of like, thank you for thinking of us and understanding how people live, whether it's, you know, different locations.
It feels as though a lot of the detailing and layouts and materials and everything is very intentional. Do you think that's something that your team, the firm pushes internally? And do you find that, you know, maybe some other firms, not necessarily a reflection of the skill set of the architect, more so the type of buildings they're working on, that it might be a little bit more rinse and repeat detailing, and you just have to accept the fact that some projects are going to be very vanilla, some projects are going to be more your show off, showpiece types?
Um, that's a good question. No, I mean, we take the same approach to every building, and whether it's a rental building, you know, something that's not exactly at the top end of a market, to the ultra luxury building like 220 Central Park South here in the city, it's the same sort of approach, I would say. And so what do I mean by that? And so if I can back up a tiny bit here, I think in general, you know, buildings have a responsibility, a few responsibilities, if you will. Number one, of course, the stakeholders, the developer, you know, we have to deliver something where they will see a return on their investment. That's been sort of a first and foremost. The second, the responsibility, I would say, is to the occupant, whether it's a renter or whether it's an owner, how they want to live. And I mentioned a little bit of that earlier. And the third thing, I would say, is sort of a civic responsibility. And by that, it's for the city. You know, not just the owner, not just the developer, but the passerby, the person that's just walking by our building, or that might see it on the skyline, a silhouette. And so even though you know someone that's walking by our building may not have a stake in it or own a unit or rent a unit, you know, at least they can appreciate the level of detail that we're providing at the ground, at the pedestrian level. And that's and also from afar, you know, if you think of coming into the city from New Jersey, from Long Island, and what have you, you know, the first thing you see are the silhouettes of the towers, right? Maybe it's a cloudy day, nothing so sort of revealing, but what you do see are the crowns of the building, the sculpting of the building, and we want to make sure we do stand out. I think that's important. You know, the Empire State, the Chrysler Building, so many of the buildings that came before have that attention to silhouette on the skyline. So we bring that sort of focus, to our design idea. Again, the civic responsibility that we're bringing with our buildings. And so all those things together, we apply those principles um, on every building, whether it's a rental, or it's a condominium, and so forth, right?
I think about, 99 Church, 220 Central Park
Yeah.
South,
Yeah.
all the projects we could name off. And these are super, super tall buildings that are going to
Sure.
stand out when I'm walking through Tribeca or downtown, and I can point to that one and tell the story. And there's a lot of context there. But when you talk about buildings standing out in a skyline or in the cityscape, because New York is so congested, it's difficult unless you're building a monumental building. When you go
Sure.
to a different market like a West Palm or a DC or a Houston, and all of a sudden your building's really going to pop, do you have is it the same approach? Is there more sensitivity?
No, it's the same exact approach. Of course, I mentioned earlier that I want our buildings to be contextual, and they are, have some type of resonance with the city, wherever it is. But it is the same exact approach. And interestingly, you mentioned a few markets. I finished a project 3 or 4 years ago in Minneapolis called 11. So it's a tower there. It's a new market for us. We've done our first residential tower there, and all of those same principles that I spoke of earlier. We applied those. Interesting skyline silhouette, how the tower meets the base, how the base meets the ground, beautifully planned units. And that's when it went online in terms of sales, it was the hottest thing in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities. And it sold out, I think, in record time, from what I understood. And interestingly enough, Minneapolis has its own set of iconic sort of images that you see. Stone Arch Bridge is right on the Mississippi River. A lot of sort of landmarks, if you will. And I've seen cooking shows, even the NCAA tournament that's on right now. Each time, where the camera crew will pan around the various landmarks around a building, they always show our tower, and that was just done, not 5 years ago. So it already is a landmark there. It's doing well, but yes, all of those principles that I spoke of earlier were applied to that building, and there you go.
When you're coming up as a young architect, and one thing that I learned and I have a newfound respect for is because I worked on the
You're an
facade
architect, right?
engineer.
Engineer.
I had a facade consulting background, and so you get into this niche area of buildings,
Right.
and then you can hyper focus on a certain subset of curtain walling or window walling or precast or brick or whatever. And there's an endless amount of information to learn from facades alone. So when I think about the fact that an architect then has to carry it to the waterproofing, to the adjacent interior layout, to the mechanical systems, to the roofing, to the lighting, to the blah blah blah, is it overwhelming? Do you feel like coming up as an architect, you probably have an interest or an eye to hyper focus on one area, or is it a broad mindset, and then as your career progresses, people typically take an interest in a certain area and become call it more of a specialist in that particular sector?
I mean, the profession as a whole is.
How did it happen for you? Let's start there.
Well, I was just very much interested in buildings and cities. I like to think that I traveled quite a bit when I was younger, and just seeing how urbanism takes place in various cities around the world, I found really fascinating. And then, like, when all that stuff comes together, what does the space in between look like, feel like? Forget about style, forget about design points of view, but just, if you can abstract things just as general masses, basic massing, how does it feel to walk down this street or this street? Like, if you've ever been to Beijing, the sense of urbanism and scale there is on another level, stratosphere altogether, versus walking down, some charming street in Rome, let's say. So, there's two different. I was just very interested in learning more about that, and why I felt a certain way in terms of experiencing a city or a street or what have you, from one city to the other, so on and so forth, right? And what this all meant in terms of culture, um, um, identity, and so forth. I remember, I think one of my favorite quotes, I think Paul Goldberger once wrote, a culture cannot exist without architecture, right? So that was pretty profound when I read that years ago, and um, so that's what kind of drew me into becoming an architect, learning more about it. So that's sort of a macro approach to your question, but I do think as you go through your life as an architect, I think some people are drawn to other aspects, whether it's becoming a consultant in curtain walls or recast assemblies for a building or whatever. There's a as a as a profession, where there's so much different directions you can go in as an architect, having that education as an architect. I've had many friends give up the profession altogether and go into advertising or media or whatever. Um, so, but yeah, I stuck with it, and there you go.
Does the opportunity to retrofit or get involved with existing buildings excite you at all?
It does. It does. And it's something we at RAMSA are trying to do more often. We are brought in to look at existing buildings and either you know try and figure out how we might fit units in there, whether rental or condominium. So we've done that quite a bit, and especially as you think of like the current state of, let's use New York because I know most about that, of available places to rent, just living. It's tough. Yeah, it's hard to find affordable living here in the city, even places to buy for the average person here in the city, and also with the trends in sort of office space, we have an abundance of empty office space. I don't think we should get into that conversation, but a lot of these buildings that are sitting empty, um, um, how might those come into the conversation and maybe solve a big problem that we have here with living here in the city? So, but yeah, we do that quite often: retrofit, rehabilitate, repurpose, if you will, existing stock.
Well, you think about what's going to attract tenants, whether it's the office or the rental space or the
Right.
condominium, and how much. For a little while, I lived in one of those old office buildings downtown that was converted into a condo. I think
Right.
Ismail Leyva did the
Yep.
retrofit, and they just had these massive, massive trading floors and area for amenity space. So you had
Yeah.
lounges and this and all this, and during COVID, it made it attractive having a lot of amenity space, especially in the winter when you didn't have the option to go out.
Sure.
And so what it takes from the office space to attract people. But when you're having these discussions about what is going to actually be implemented in some of our projects and buildings, I always make the joke about the operable window discussion. We talk about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% cost difference, and then you just ask the person, well, if you were in your living room, would you want to be able to open the windows? And it's putting yourself in the mind of the occupant is more challenging for some than others, but I think when that clicks and you get it, you really get it in terms of natural ventilation and daylighting and window to wall ratio and window placement and all these
Sure.
things of how that actually plays into the user experience. And do you think that is that like an area of collaboration between you and the interior team?
Well, I think there's always cost premiums that are involved when you're specifying well, a few things: cost premiums with using an operable window, right, versus something that's more fixed. It also carries over into the energy standard that they want to reach, whether it's LEED or, in fact, something like Passive House. Is a project we're doing in Vancouver right now that will be Passive House certified when it's finished. I don't know if you've heard of it. It'll be the
I
largest.
remember us talking about it
Yeah,
somewhere deep
yeah,
in the South, and that I'm
that's
glad
right.
you brought that up. Let's go
Yeah,
into that one next.
but even that requires extremely airtight envelopes, right? And which means essentially no operable windows. Now, having said all that, I don't care, I do care that, the building is energy responsible, all of those things. But, I do like the breeze to come in too. So I'm all for introducing operable windows, hoppers, casements, what have you, in office and also, of course, in residential. But in office, because an office space, 5, 10, whatever down the line, it may not be an office space. You might be converted into, condominiums or rentals.
It's very interesting that you just said that, because I think people's head would go first to the precedent would be operable windows in a multifamily. Why would you need it in an office? But that was a really important point you
Yeah,
just brought up, thinking about the future retrofit or adaptability of a space.
right. No, you have to think down the lines too. I mean, I think what you're gonna see, or what we are now seeing in terms of how buildings are programmed, if it's for this use or that use or what have you, you know, in its life cycle, in its lifespan, those uses will probably change. For example, like garages, you used to see um, sloped parking, ramps everywhere to make it, to do a standalone garage. But this has been pretty common now. Everything is essentially flat in a garage. Why? Because who knows how long cars will be part of our lives. But a garage might turn into something else, whether it's an office or whether it's something to live in. And you can't live on sloped ramps, right? So that's why everything is flat these days in garage. That's just one example. So you have to think about the future of a building.
And even I'm gonna knock on the curtain wall and window wall industry for a second.
Yep.
Curtain wall, well, call it a lot of iterations of prior curtain wall designs were very difficult to maintain in terms of getting access to your chicken head seals and getting access to concealed areas 20, 30, 40 years down the line to maintain. And then with window wall, it's a pain to rip out your receptors and get to some areas that have been concealed if you do want to replace those units, where in more of an opaque punched window configuration, if you're just maintaining your exterior applied caulk joints or replacing your punched windows,
Right.
there's more of a sort of rinse and repeat longer term life cycle to that type of building.
Right, right. And that's more of, I think, your specialty. But in my opinion, I think you have to anticipate accessibility, whether it's 5 years down the line, a tenant breaks the window, breaks the glass. How are you going to pop it out? Is it easy to pop out? How are you going to get to it from the inside, from the outside? So all those things do come into play, but um, I do hope that like someone in your shoes rather, brings that to the conversation first and foremost, how you do maintain, these systems. It's window wall, curtain wall, or what have you, right? So,
The Passive House project in Vancouver, were you guys brought on? Was that decided after you were brought on they wanted to go in the passive house direction, or did you know up front?
no, we knew up front. Yeah,
And
yeah.
what type of challenges came up that were unexpected, and the airtightness, interestingly, but in terms of detailing and actual execution?
Well, that project is still on the boards, and we're now in our, it seems like probably 8, 9 years now, which is rare for
Wow.
a project. I won't get into too much detail, but the approvals process and the permitting and all those things that happen in Vancouver take a long, long time. Oh my
And that
word.
must have been an owner that really wanted to work with you to bring you up there.
It was, yeah, they were aware of of the buildings that we had done, around the world, and they wanted to bring that, same sensitivity to Vancouver, this sort of more of a masonry look. And if you've been to Vancouver, uh, um,
You don't
it's
have that up
still,
there. I
you
know
know,
that. I've spent time up there.
There you go. Yeah. Cole Harbor, I believe that's the neighborhood. And it's just a sea of very banal, boring glass buildings. I'm not opposed to glass buildings, but anyway, these were just a sea of glass buildings, if you can imagine that. So if you have a Ramza building, punched window look, all those things, in that, it's really going to stand out, right? But back to Passive House, yes, it was on the table from the get-go. And some of the challenges, well, number one was learning about this new standard. It's different from something like LEED or these other green standard initiatives that are more prominent. But Passive House essentially is it's a standard. I think it was originated in Germany, I believe, and it requires just incredibly thick walls on the exterior, incredible amounts of insulation, triple glazed glass systems, no thermal bridging for balconies, all these things. So it was a little bit of a learning curve for us, but we picked up quite quickly to that standard. And so one of the big challenges, I'll give you one of them, as it relates to windows, for example, if we're, let's say, doing a 2-light system or a 3-light system in a typical punched window, let's say, where you might have something operable. We talked about that earlier. All right, there's no operable windows except for balcony doors or sliders. But for the most part, the majority of the windows were just single pane glass. And I mentioned double light windows. What we do like to have are true divided lights, right? 2 independent pieces of insulating glass with a divider, a muntin or a mullion. Here, we couldn't do that. We still wanted to have that sort of
The look, but
multi-light
still
window.
achieving the actual thermal performance of it.
Right, exactly, because that would create a thermal bridge going inside and out, right? So what we did was, if you can imagine one sheet of glass, you have the mullions, we detach those, so they're floating. They're completely independent of that sheet of glass. So from the outside, as you're looking up at the building, you do get a sense as to true divided lights, but in reality, it's just one big sheet of glass. That's one of the challenges and the solutions we came up with to sort of get the best of both worlds.
Do you think that for a project years ago to pursue that certification is sort of ahead of their time? And ironically, I've been hearing a lot in Boston that just given the current energy code requirements and some of the owners wanting to deem themselves and differentiate are proactively pursuing the certification. So I'll first say, did this Vancouver owner do it for a marketability from a marketability perspective? And do you think it's going to gain more traction in some of these markets?
Marketability, I think they did get some tax breaks on it, which rightfully so. I would hope you'll get tax breaks for
Right. Yeah.
for trying to get a building like this. Just because standard construction, your wall thickness, finished interior to finished exterior might be 8 inches, 9 inches, 10 inches, depending on the substrate of the cladding and so forth. But Passive House, we're looking at 18 inches, maybe 2 feet. So if your building footprint cannot get any bigger, your interiors take up that interior sellable takes up that extra square footage, which means you're selling less,
which is huge in New York.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean every inch counts, and they want to sell every inch, obviously. But so I think it was more on tax incentive. They got a little bit of height out of it. They could introduce a few more floors, a few more a few other things, bells and whistles that the city gave them. Now from a marketing point of view, I think the public, buyers are very much interested in sustainable practices, right? Or they should be, and they're becoming more and more aware of that. And with something like a Passive House building, when you have that level of insulation, of air tightness, what that also means is you're getting smaller systems, smaller mechanical systems, how to heat and cool your unit, provide hot water. All those systems are much, much smaller because energy is not lost versus a conventional construction. Conventional glazing, for example, there is a lot of loss in terms of heat, cooling, and so forth.
Well,
And
you're
thus you need,
starting with the envelope. You're not playing
right,
catch up with the envelope based on poor mechanical
exactly.
systems.
Yeah. And then when mechanical systems are smaller, less pollutants, less emissions into the atmosphere, so on and so forth. So that's a big plus. In fact, I think Passive House should broadcast that a little bit louder because that's a big thing when you think about it. The building industry, buildings themselves contribute a huge amount of emissions, carbon emissions. And but anyway, yeah. So
The standard's tremendous, and the truth is kind of like what we're seeing in Boston and some other markets. It's not like we have to use anything. Um, we're using systems and practices that are already kind of tried and true. It's just implementing them from day one.
yeah,
But it's I didn't even think about the tax incentive or break or what they can get from building with that sort of standard in mind early on. What do you find in New York? Do you find that sort of government regulations and zoning and things did things ease up as we approach a time of crisis, call it either a housing shortage or we're in the midst of a recession, all of a sudden are that they like, all right, we can ease up on things just to respark activity?
New York's is an interesting place, but there have been uh, sustainability measures. I think what is it called? New York 2050. I think that was implemented before this the current mayor Adams. I think De Blasio may have done it. But where buildings have to hit a certain set of energy requirements by I think 2050. I could be wrong on that date, but so that's been around, and a lot of buildings that do not meet those standards will have to retrofit to meet those standards. And then some other initiatives that are happening. For example, uh, uh, gas appliances will also be a thing of the past unless you're grandfathered in or you're a restaurant. Yeah, there's some uh, um, sort of types that are still that will still be allowed. In fact, I love gas, but I can imagine not going to electric. But anyway, there are other things that are on the boards right now. But I think for some of this stuff to really be taken seriously, I don't know too much about what's happening in Boston, as you mentioned. Like there should be, city, even federal mandates on how buildings should perform um, um, and be instituted. Then we would all follow those requirements as we design buildings. But right now, I think whether it's tax incentives in Vancouver or if it's if it's not mandated by the local government, then it's going to be hard for developers to follow that, right? Because usually there's a premium that comes with doing these types of meeting these types of standards. It's just more
Well, have
expensive.
you have you found the biggest change is typically sparked from, again, either a sudden new code hitting us or some type of crisis? For instance, how have you or how has the firm responded to the bird-friendly glazing mandate here in the city?
Well, that's good. I applaud it 100%. And we we're not lawbreakers here, and we in fact we uh, from a personal point of view, I certainly encourage that and would hope all buildings would follow that requirement with glazing. But yes, I mean, we're aware of it, and the buildings we do here in the city do follow those requirements for our
Yeah, I
glazing.
more so mean from a design and aesthetic standpoint. I mean, what we found is that it was enacted, last January or well over a year ago now. And snap of a finger, your high-rise condominium or high-end condominiums or rental buildings had to comply with this
Right.
bird-friendly glazing requirement, which, okay, they say you have to meet a certain threat factor, fine, as long as your glass meets it. But A, making sure that it complies legally or per code, but then B, making sure you can live with it from an aesthetic standpoint, and making sure like this is going to be in this building next door, that building's not going to have it. And so all of a sudden, which is more attractive to the tenant?
Yeah, well, I mean, remind me again, Adrian, it's a certain amount of reflectivity that you apply toward glazing, correct? Is that
Basically, you could either have a frit pattern so you could see the dots,
right?
or they have these UV interlayers that are transparent. And so from certain angles, you could birds can see the pattern, but from
Yeah,
spot on, most
that's right.
humans can't see it. It just
Yeah,
comes at a premium, A, and B, there's a limited supply chain.
right, right. No, I mean, all of our buildings, we always try and specify the clearest of glass, low E. And then a few things we want with the glass performance. That's sort of number one. We would love for it to be clear. Number two, reflectivity on the glass. I would love to see that just go away completely. That's just aesthetic point of view. I don't want to see a complete, a mirror building. Always looks awful, completely awful. You can't see kind of what's going on the inside. I love to see, curtains that are drawn here or there. It gives the building a little bit of personality. It lets you understand that people actually do live there or work there or what have you. So we like clear glass. Now with this other standard, the frit, I'm pretty sure each time we specify that glass, it's always with a UV coating on the inside and not the frit. I think that kind of diminishes from the overall look of a building. But as you mentioned, there are two ways to solve that problem with birds.
And there's major cost implications. That was the big
Sure.
problem during it hit us during COVID. There were
Yeah.
major cost implications, and then we had limited design options, and we had to make decisions to move forward.
Yeah.
So that was a major challenge, which in the snap of a finger impacted the entire city.
Yeah.
But without that mandate, the adoption in other markets has been incredibly slow, which is
Sure.
why, I feel like the building industry in general is so slow to evolve and move that unless something's mandated, people are going to take the path of least resistance.
Sure. But I think with most new requirements, I think in time you'll find more and more suppliers. Mentioning the supply chain, you know, production rather, grow as time goes on. So hopefully the price premium does come down. But yeah, with any new technology, new requirement that comes out, there's always going to be, we're going to run to the hills. It's too expensive to do this project or that project. But I think things will even out. They always do in the end,
Yep,
right?
agreed. All right, so what are some, on a finishing note, what are some projects that you're most excited about? I know you shared Vancouver, but projects in other markets where people can be looking out for your work.
Two projects that I'm very excited about. Well, the firm as a whole, we're seeing an uptick of new work, new projects in South Florida, even Central Florida. So we have quite a few buildings on the boards there. There's one tower, a condominium tower that I'm working on with the Related Group out of South Florida, called it's the St. Regis Residences in Brickell. Amazing location, views of the water, beautiful neighborhood. A lot of glass on
I
that
know it
building, by
well.
the way. Yeah. So that one I'm really excited about. And then the other one is a project that we're doing in Texas, in the Woodlands. If your listeners aren't familiar with the Woodlands, it's a beautiful little community just north of Houston proper. And this is for the Ritz. So to be a branded residential with the Ritz. And it's a slightly different sort of, I wouldn't say typology, it is condominium, but uh, my studio, we're often known for very tall towers all across the US and the globe, but this one is more of a sort of a rambling arrangement of two towers, 14 stories on one West Tower. The other one, I believe, is 12 stories. And it has a very sort of sculpted skyline profile to it. And I was just down there last week for the opening of the sales gallery on Tuesday of last week. And out of 111 units, you know, I think almost 50% have been spoken for already, sold. So it's amazing.
Wow.
I'm not sure if that was public information or not, so we may have to strike that from the recording. But I'm very proud of that project. This one, again, high-end luxury condominium. There's going to be a Jean-Georges restaurant. You have the Ritz. You have the architecture by Ramza, which is great. We did all the floor plans, 36 unique floor plans in that project. That's a lot. That's a lot to design. So we spent a lot of time on the plans. And it's all lake views in the woodlands. So it's a really interesting project. I think it's the sort of talk of the town at the moment, and I think it will be the premier residence, not just in the woodlands, but in all of Houston. So I'm very excited to see um, um, that project, go up. So
Very cool. And I've been spending a lot of time in Florida. When can we see progress at the St. Regis?
I think there should be, well, you know what, if the next time you're down there, do check out the sales center. It's open. So it's right there on the site. Do check it out. And I believe they're going to start site work this year, without a doubt. So yeah,
Very
you
cool.
should see it rising from the ground this year.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
Well, Johnny, I enjoyed it. I appreciate you coming on. It was good insight.
All right. Great to be
All
on
right.
your show. We'll talk soon.
Take care.
Okay,
Yeah.
Drew.
Thank you.
Take care, man. Thank you.